They laughed when I spent $47,000 on 18 yaks nobody wanted, in a valley that already had 4,000 head of cattle starving for real snow feed. That was the spring of 2019, 8,200 feet up, 6 months after I buried my grandfather Silas Whitlock under the larch trees behind the barn. If you're watching this from somewhere the wind actually bites your face right now, tell me where, then hit like and subscribe, because this story only makes sense to people who felt a mountain try to kill them before breakfast. 3 loops before we go further. 1. The resort company circling my 640 acres, because the only flat approach to Wolf Creek Pass runs straight through my south pasture, and they had a deadline stamped on a letter. 2. An entire valley that decided a woman alone with a dead man's ledgers was a joke worth repeating at the feed store, including a state agent with a clipboard and a neighbor who never once said it to my face. 3. 18 ugly, shaggy, foul-tempered animals standing in my north field, and the question of whether they'd still be standing there the day everyone needed them to be. My grandfather ran cattle on this land for 51 years, 210 head at the peak, before the winter of '96, took 90 of them in 11 days when the pass sealed shut and the hay trucks couldn't get through. He never talked about that winter except in the ledgers. 17 leather-bound books, cracked spine, cattle feed stains on the covers, stacked in the tack room like nobody was ever supposed to read them as anything other than a chore log, calving dates, frost depth measured with a broken thermometer and a nail. The exact day the elk moved down off the ridge each October, 3 years running, within 48 hours of each other. He wrote the way he talked, which was almost never, and only about things he'd actually watched happen. The tack room itself smelled of neatsfoot oil and old leather even in deep winter, a smell I associate now with grief, the way other people associate it with flowers. Each ledger cover was scuffed pale at the corner where a thumb had held it open 1,000 times, and inside, his handwriting shrank a little every decade, cramped, economical, never a wasted word, numbers underlined instead of explained. 31 degrees at the north fence, 6 a.m., March 14th. No adjective, no complaint, just the fact. Set down like a stone, waiting for someone patient enough to stack the stones into a wall. I inherited more than land that November. I inherited 41 head of cattle nobody had gotten around to selling, a diesel tractor with a cracked block, $300 in a coffee can above the stove, and a debt to the county for back taxes he'd been quietly behind on for 2 years without telling a soul, not even Earl, who considered himself close enough to know. I found that debt notice in an unopened envelope dated August, 4 months before he died, still sealed, like he'd meant to deal with it and simply run out of time. I paid it in January with money I didn't have, and that, more than the funeral, is the moment I actually understood the ranch was mine now, in every sense that mattered, including the parts nobody warns you about. He died in November, heart, no warning, found by Earl Higgins from the next ranch over, when the mail piled up at the box for 4 days. I was 31, living 200 miles south, doing books for a feed distributor, and inside 6 weeks, I owned 640 acres of mountain, 41 cows that hadn't sold before he died, a barn that needed a new roof by spring, and 17 books I hadn't opened yet. I moved up in December. The valley had an opinion about that before I'd unpacked a single box. The first time I met Randall Caldwell was in February, in my own kitchen, snow banked to the window ledge outside, him in a camel hair coat and shoes, with a leather sole so smooth he nearly went down on my porch steps. He represented Sawtooth Alpine Holdings, a Healy skiing and luxury lodge outfit that had been trying to buy access to Wolf Creek Pass for 6 years, blocked every time by my grandfather's refusal to sell so much as an easement. Caldwell smiled the way men smile when they've already decided you're a formality. He offered $900,000 for the south pasture, 80 acres, the only stretch flat enough for a road, and said it twice, slow, like I might need the number repeated for a woman's benefit. I told him I'd think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. He left a card on my table that I later used to level a wobbling table leg in the barn, and I want you to remember that detail, because it comes back. The ledgers took me 3 weeks to read start to finish, by lamp, after chores, my breath fogging in a kitchen the wood stove never quite won against. Buried in the 1987 volume, one line, underlined twice in pencil so hard it tore the page: "Yaks handle what cattle can't. Ought to have tried it before my knees went bad." Nothing else. No plan, no follow-up entry. Just a dead man's regret, 20 years old, waiting for someone to read it in the right winter. I sat with that page longer than any other in 17 books. I turned it toward the lamp to check I hadn't misread his hand, checked the date against the drought entries 3 pages earlier, checked it again the next morning in daylight. There was no elaboration anywhere else in the volume, no second mention in the 8 ledgers that followed, as if he'd written it once, meant every word, and then let the idea die quietly with his knees and his diminishing herd size. I understood almost immediately why he never acted on it. A rancher 51 years into cattle doesn't retool his entire operation on a hunch scrawled at 11 at night. But I was 31, 6 weeks a landowner, with nothing left to protect that hadn't already been risked the day I signed the deed transfer. The sentence stopped being his regret and started being my instruction the 3rd time I read it. I called 3 breeders before I found one in Wyoming willing to sell a starter herd. 18 animals, mixed ages, black and gold-brown coats thick as a doormat, horns curved back like they'd been drawn by somebody who'd never seen a real animal. $47,000, every cent I had left after the funeral and the roof, wired on a Tuesday in March, the same week Caldwell's letter arrived reminding me his offer expired May 1st. I stood in my kitchen with both numbers in front of me, his $900,000, my $47,000. And I want to be honest with you, my hands weren't steady when I signed that wire transfer. I didn't cry. I never let myself do that where anyone could see it, not even the dog. But I sat at that table a long time after, the wood stove ticking, before I picked up a pen and got back to work. The truck arrived the 2nd week of April, a stock trailer hauled 600 miles from Wyoming, diesel exhaust hanging blue in cold morning air, while the driver backed it against my loading ramp, with a patience that told me he'd done this delivery before and had opinions about it he kept to himself. Half the valley found a reason to drive past my gate that week. Feed runs that could have waited, a fence check nobody needed to make in April, one truck circling twice. Earl Higgins leaned on his fence rail as 18 yaks came down the ramp, snorting steam into 40-degree air, hooves loud and hollow against the metal, and he laughed loud enough I heard it from the barn, said I'd bought myself a petting zoo instead of a ranch. He said it to his wife, not to me, but sound carries clean across open pasture, and I made sure my face gave him nothing to repeat. Dale Pruitt, the county extension agent, drove out 2 days later with a clipboard and a printed sheet of average weight gain statistics for commercial cattle breeds in this elevation band, and told me, not unkindly, that I was welcome to keep them as a hobby, but that no bank would ever underwrite a herd with no established feed conversion data in this county. He said established 4 times in 6 minutes. I wrote the number down anyway, in my own new ledger, the first page of what would become Volume 18, right under my grandfather's last entry. Established or not, I told him, they're still standing in 20 inches of snow, eating what your cattle won't touch. He didn't have an answer that day. He had a different answer, months later, and we'll get there. I spent that whole first summer alone with them, learning what my grandfather never got the chance to. There was no manual for this, no extension pamphlet, nothing but daily observation written down the way he'd taught me, without ever meaning to teach me anything. Yaks don't need imported hay shipped up a pass that closes 11 days a year on average. They graze through snow cattle can't break with a hoof, digging with a motion closer to a plow than a paw, a slow patient shoveling with the muzzle that uncovers forage no Angus or Hereford could reach past 8 inches of crust. I'd watch them from the porch at dawn, breath clouding, coffee gone cold in my hand, timing how long each animal worked a single patch of snow before moving on, writing the minutes down in a column I invented myself because nothing in his ledgers covered an animal he'd never owned. Their wool undercoat, the down they call kulu, sheds out every June in loose handfuls I collected by hand into feed sacks, 41 pounds that first year, soft as a whisper against fingers cracked from cold and lanolin, smelling faintly of grass and something almost sweet underneath the animal musk. I sent a sample to an outdoor apparel company in Bozeman on a whim, no real expectation, in a padded envelope I nearly didn't mail, and got a letter back in July asking for £100 the following year at $18 an ounce, a number I read 3 times at my kitchen table to make sure I hadn't misread a decimal, then a 4th time out loud, alone, just to hear it confirmed in my own voice. Please, if this kind of quiet stubbornness means anything to you, if you've ever bet everything you had left on something everyone around you called foolish, hit subscribe right now, because the valley wasn't finished laughing yet, and neither am I. By September the 2nd, corporate visit came, not Caldwell this time, but a lawyer named Priya Reyes, sent to clean up the paperwork on an easement Sawtooth claimed had been verbally promised by my grandfather in 2015, a claim with no signature, no witness, nothing but a typed memo from their own file. She sat in my kitchen in a blazer entirely wrong for the weather, a leather folio open on the table between us like it might intimidate the wood grain, and explained, gently, condescendingly, in the tone people use for children and the recently bereaved, that continued refusal could result in a right-of-way petition through the county, that it would be so much simpler for everyone if I just signed now, before things escalated into something neither of us would enjoy. I let the silence sit a full 10 seconds before I answered, because my grandfather's ledgers taught me that too. Never fill a silence just because someone else finds it uncomfortable. I told her to bring me the 2015 document with my grandfather's signature on it, and if it existed, we'd talk. It never arrived. Not that week, not that year. She left the same way Caldwell had, unhurried, folio closed. Certain time was on her side, the same certainty I was starting to recognize as the one thing every one of them had in common. October brought the second ridicule, worse than the first because it came with an audience. The County Ag Extension held its annual fall meeting at the Grange Hall. 40 ranchers and their wives, coffee burning lukewarm in styrofoam cups, folding chairs scraping linoleum every time somebody shifted, and Dale Pruitt stood up with a slide projector and a chart titled Regional Livestock Viability, Cattle Breed by Cattle Breed, Weight Gain Plotted Against Elevation Band, every number sourced and footnoted the way a man dresses up an opinion to look like a fact. My name wasn't on it, my herd wasn't on it, because, he said to the room, adjusting his glasses like the sentence cost him nothing, unregistered novelty breeds don't factor into forage allocation planning. Somebody laughed. I think it was Earl, though I never turned around to check, because turning around would have meant giving the sound somewhere to land. I sat in the back row in my grandfather's old canvas coat, the one that still smelled faintly of diesel and hay dust no matter how many times I washed it, and I didn't say a word. On the drive home I said the only thing I let myself say out loud that whole year, into the empty cab of my truck, in his voice more than mine, established don't mean a damn thing until the snow tells you who's right. It was something he'd written in the '81 Ledger, about a drought nobody believed was coming. I'd read it so many times it had stopped being his handwriting in my head and started being an instruction. The county road crew hadn't reached my stretch of gravel by then, and every trip into town that whole autumn meant a rutted 40 minutes each way, radio hissing static past the ridgeline, headlights catching nothing but snow ghosting sideways across the beam. I made those trips anyway, twice a week, feed store and hardware store and the co-op, because a ranch alone doesn't run itself just because the roads get hard, and my grandfather's own truck's logs, kept in the glove box of every vehicle he ever owned, going back to a 1968 flatbed, showed he'd made worse trips in worse years, without ever once writing down that it had scared him. That winter tested every number Pruitt had put on a slide. December brought 40 inches in 9 days, snow stacking against the north fence in drifts taller than the posts. The whole valley gone silent under it, the particular way heavy snowfall silences a place, sound swallowed before it travels 10 feet. My yaks pushed through snowpack that stopped my neighbor's cattle cold, digging craters down to bare grass with slow rhythmic strokes of the muzzle, while, a quarter-mile off across the fence line, Hereford and Angus stood bunched shoulder to shoulder, bawling, breath freezing white above their backs, losing condition fast enough you could see ribs by Christmas, through coats gone dull and staring. I lost 0 animals that month. I walked the herd myself every morning at 5, headlamp cutting a small yellow circle into total dark, counting 18 sets of curved horns against snow glare, writing each count in the new ledger, before I let myself go back inside for coffee. Earl Higgins lost 6 calves to exposure before New Year's, a number he didn't share at the Grange Hall, though I heard it from his own hired hand at the feed store, unprompted, almost apologetic, like he needed someone outside his own gate to know the actual cost of it. January is when Caldwell came back the second time, and this time there was no camel hair coat, no easy smile. Sawtooth's investors had set a hard construction deadline tied to the following ski season, and every alternate route into the pass had failed engineering review. Too steep, too avalanche-prone, too expensive to blast. My 80 flat acres were the only viable road left in the entire basin, and his deadline was now my leverage instead of his. He sat in the same kitchen chair as before and offered $1.4 million, 40% above his original number, and asked, almost pleading, if there was any arrangement at all we could reach. I told him the same thing I'd told Reyes. Bring me proof, not pressure, and we'll talk when I'm ready, not when your calendar says you need to be. He left his card again. I still had the first one holding up the table leg. February is when the pass sealed for 11 days straight, the worst closure since my grandfather's winter of '96. 106 inches falling faster than the county plows could clear switchbacks blasted into rock at 9,000 feet. Feed trucks couldn't get through to 6 ranches above the slide zone, mine included on paper, though I hadn't ordered outside hay in 10 months. 2 ranchers lost entire herds to starvation and exposure before the 5th day. The county called an emergency meeting, and somebody, I never found out who, though I have a guess, mentioned that the Whitlock place had yaks capable of packing supply loads through snow no truck or horse could manage, animals bred for exactly this altitude, exactly this crisis. By day 6, I was leading 4 of my yaks loaded with hay bales and medical supplies over a ridge trail my grandfather had marked in the 1974 ledger as passable in conditions nothing else could handle. The trail itself was barely a trail, a shelf of exposed rock and packed drift along the east face, wind sideways and hard enough to steal my breath if I faced it wrong. The yaks moving with a low, steady patience through drifts that would have swallowed a horse to the chest. I led them on foot, rope in one gloved hand, my grandfather's old canvas coat zipped to the chin, repeating his line under my breath every 50 yards like a metronome, established, "Don't mean a damn thing," until it stopped being a comfort and just became the rhythm my boots moved to. 2.5 hours out, 2.5 back, 4 separate trips over 6 days, delivering feed and insulin and diesel filters to 2 stranded ranches, including Earl Higgins's. He met me at his gate, hollow-eyed, 3 days without real sleep, and he didn't laugh. He said thank you, quiet, looking somewhere past my shoulder instead of at my face, and I said the same 4 words back to him I'd said to Pruitt in April. Established don't mean much. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't need to be. The snow had already said everything I would have wanted to say myself. By day 9, with the county's own emergency response photographing yak-pack trains crossing terrain their vehicles couldn't touch, Dale Pruitt drove out, not to my kitchen this time, but to the Grange Hall podium 2 weeks later, at the same meeting series where he'd shown that chart in October. He stood up with a revised slide, and this one had a line item that hadn't existed 6 months earlier: alternative high-altitude livestock, emergency logistics viability, confirmed. He didn't apologize by name. He didn't have to. 40 ranchers in that room had already watched hay bales cross a ridge 4 Angus couldn't have survived, on the backs of animals he'd called a hobby. Sawtooth Alpine Holdings folded their route application within the month, not because I'd refused them, but because the same storm that vindicated my herd had triggered 3 new slide hazard designations across their only viable corridor, land the county now classified as unbuildable, regardless of who owned it. Caldwell called once more, in March, not to negotiate the south pasture anymore, but to ask, almost sheepish, whether I'd consider selling Kulu wool to a resort gift line he was still trying to salvage out of the wreckage of his own project. I said I'd think about it. This time I actually did, and I said yes, on my terms, my price, my contract, drafted by a lawyer I hired with wool money instead of his. If you've ever watched the people who mocked you need something from you within the same year, subscribe now, because the next part is the part that took decades, not months, and I promised myself I wouldn't skip it just because it's slower. The years after moved the way real vindication actually moves, which is to say, slowly, and mostly without an audience. By the 5th year my herd was 91 animals. The wool contract with the Bozeman Company grew to 400 pounds annually, at rates that eventually let me pay off the ranch outright, something my grandfather never managed in 51 years of cattle. Dale Pruitt retired in year 7, and I heard secondhand that his final report to the state board cited my operation as a case study in adaptive high-altitude livestock management. My name spelled correctly this time, first time in 8 years anybody at that office had bothered. Earl Higgins converted a third of his own herd to a mixed yak cattle operation in year 4. Quietly, no announcement, just a truck delivering 6 animals to his gate on a Tuesday, and he never once brought up the Grange Hall meeting again, and neither did I. Priya Reyes left Sawtooth's legal department the following spring for a firm representing land conservancies instead of developers. I don't know if that meant anything, but I noted it in the ledger anyway, because my grandfather taught me to write down what happened, not what it should have meant. Randall Caldwell and I have a wool supply contract now in its 11th year, renegotiated twice, always in my kitchen, always on my schedule, always over coffee. I make him drink black because I never bothered stocking cream for a man who used to make me feel like a formality. He wears different shoes to the ranch these days, the kind with actual tread, laced tight, mud-crusted by the time he reaches my porch, the camel hair coat replaced years ago by something practical he clearly bought specifically for these visits. I never gloated about it, not once, not even the year the resort project he'd originally wanted my land for went bankrupt entirely, swallowed by lawsuits from investors over the same slide-hazard zoning that had once threatened to erase my herd's grazing range. I read about it in the county paper and went back out to check on a pregnant heifer instead of celebrating anything. I have 208 yaks now, across 1,100 acres I've bought, and merged from 3 ranches that couldn't survive the winters the old way. One of them Earl's neighbor to the north, who sold out entirely in year 6 and moved to town, unable to keep pace with feed costs that kept climbing every winter. The old methods stayed the old methods. I bought that parcel at a fair price, not a discounted one. I never let a single negotiation in this valley become about anyone else's misfortune, because that was never the point, and my grandfather's ledgers never once recorded a grudge, only a fact. And I intended to keep it that way in my own volumes too. I still write in the ledgers every night, volume 31 now, the shelf in the tack room 3 books longer than my grandfather ever filled in his own lifetime. 2 winters ago I started teaching my grandniece, 17 years old, sharp-eyed, unimpressed by anyone's opinion of her, the exact way I once had to learn to be, how to read frost depth with nothing but a broken thermometer and a steady hand, the same way he taught nobody, because there was nobody left by the time he might have wanted to. I handed her the newest ledger on her 16th birthday, told her the only rule that ever mattered on this land: write down what you actually watched happen, not what people told you would happen, and let the snow settle every argument you're too tired to keep having out loud. She asked me once if I ever doubted it, that first winter, standing in a field with 18 ugly animals, and every neighbor's laughter following me home from the feed store. I told her the truth, sitting across the same kitchen table where Caldwell once left his first business card, where Reyes once opened her leather folio, where I once signed a wire transfer for every dollar I had left. That doubt shows up whether you invite it or not, and the only thing that matters is what you do with your hands while it's sitting there next to you. She didn't ask a follow-up question. She just nodded the way he used to, and went back out to check the herd before the light went, and I sat there a while longer, listening to the wood stove tick the same way it ticked the night I wired $47,000 to a stranger in Wyoming, and thought that maybe this was what it actually meant to hand something down, not the land itself, not even the ledgers, but the particular quiet of knowing what to do with your hands while everyone around you is certain you're wrong. What would you have done, standing in that kitchen in March, with a wire transfer form for every dollar you had left in one hand, and a stranger's $900,000 offer in the other? Because next winter's storm is already forming somewhere over that same ridge right now, and there's a reason my grandniece just started keeping her own count of the elk moving down early this year, 3 days ahead of schedule, which hasn't happened since the winter my grandfather never talked about, And if you want to know what that number actually means before anyone else in this valley figures it out, you already know what to do before the next video loads.